media.
The last potluck. Ben sat in the maintenance office, staring at the old analog clock mounted on the wall, its cheap plastic frame yellowed with age, the second hand jerking forward with a barely audible tick. It was 11:42 a.m. The potluck started at noon sharp. His stomach churned, not from hunger but from something else, something deeper. He didn't want to go, didn't want to sit among them, listen to their corporate speak, their hollow gratitude, their smug reminders that he was nothing more than a cog in their machine. But attendance was mandatory, no exceptions. He had been with the company for 9 years, 9 long, grueling years, crawling under leaking pipes, fixing machinery no one else wanted to touch, working in sweltering boiler rooms and freezing mechanical bays. He was the best they had, and they knew it. His efficiency rating was 99.98%, a record no one else had even come close to. But when it came time for his annual review, when he rated himself 4 stars for his work ethic and commitment, they had laughed in his face. "There's no such thing as a 4-star employee, Ben," his manager had said with a smirk, crossing out his self-evaluation before handing him the official verdict. A $2 raise, a pat on the back. "You should be grateful." Grateful. That word rang in his head like a death knell. Ben wasn't grateful. Not anymore. Not after everything he had given them. He had nearly died 10 years ago, spent 6 weeks in intensive care, fought for his life while doctors and hospital administrators picked apart his savings like vultures. The medical bills crushed him. By the time he was discharged, he was financially ruined, penniless, drowning in debt, harassed by collectors at all hours. He had no choice but to declare bankruptcy. His apartment manager was demanding 3 months' rent up front for his lease renewal. His wife, well, she had found comfort elsewhere, while he was off driving oil field maintenance trucks through the most godforsaken parts of the country. The money had been good, really good. But when he got sick, everything unraveled. He lost everything. Now, he was 60 years old next month, with nothing to show for his life, but calloused hands and a broken back. But none of it mattered anymore. Not after last week. Not after the envelope had arrived in the mail. His passport, his ticket out. Ben pulled himself out of his chair, stretched his aching joints, and walked over to the heavy cast iron pot sitting on the counter. He lifted the lid and inhaled deeply. His chili, his masterpiece, the one thing in his life that he still had pride in. 5 blue ribbons at state fairs, a recipe passed down for generations, perfected over decades, slow-cooked for hours, every spice balanced with precision. It was always the first thing to disappear at these potlucks. He ladled out a small spoonful, tasted it, and nodded. Perfect. He carried the pot to the break room, where tables were already lined with food. Store-bought pasta salads, overcooked casseroles, a few sad trays of deli meats. People greeted him with nods and half smiles, already eyeing the chili like vultures. No one asked how he was doing. No one cared. At exactly noon, the managers filed in, took their places at the front, and launched into their usual speech. The company had broken records this quarter, record profits, record growth, and, of course, record generosity. Because weren't they so kind to host this potluck? The employees should be thankful, should be proud, should feel like part of a family. Ben stared at them, feeling the anger simmering just beneath his skin, slow and controlled, like the heat of his chili. He thought about the last 9 years, about every extra hour he had worked, unpaid, about every injury he had shrugged off because sick leave was a privilege, not a right, about every time he had been passed over for a real raise, every time he had been told to be grateful. He smirked as he filled his plate. A double cheeseburger would cost more than the raise they gave him. The food disappeared quickly. His chili, as expected, was the first to go. Employees went back for seconds and thirds, wiping their bowls clean. The senior managers helped themselves to generous portions, barely acknowledging him as they did. Ben sat in the corner, eating quietly, letting it all sink in. This was his last day here. Tomorrow morning he would be on a plane. He hadn't told a soul. No goodbyes, no resignation letter, nothing. They would realize it soon enough. He left before the potluck ended, walking out the door without a word, without looking back. Monday the office was in chaos. At least 45 employees had called in sick. Stomach cramps, fever, vomiting, diarrhea, violent, uncontrollable. HR was in a panic. Some employees had gone to the emergency room. Others were stuck in bed, unable to move. The break room was empty. The offices, half deserted. Ben's manager was fuming. Not only had half the workforce vanished overnight, but Ben himself hadn't shown up. No email, no call, nothing. His locker was empty. His desk cleared out. Just gone. Someone made a joke in the hallway, nervous laughter bubbling up in the tension. Someone probably shit in the chili. The laughter died quickly. Then someone else muttered, "Where's Ben?" Calls were made. No answer. His apartment? Empty. No forwarding address. No trace. And then, on Thursday, the newspaper headlines hit. Feces detected in Potluck chili. 48 hospitalized for food poisoning. Silence. The entire company seemed to freeze. Whispers spread like wildfire. People exchanged glances, stomachs turning. The HR department scrambled to contain the situation. There were hushed meetings, closed-door discussions. But the damage was done. No one could prove anything. No one could say for sure. But the thought lingered, a slow, creeping horror. They had eaten his chili. And Ben? Ben was long gone. The butcher's secret. There was something about the smell that made your stomach tighten with hunger the moment you stepped onto the cracked pavement outside Brannigan's butcher shop. It was a scent unlike any other, a thick, almost sweet aroma that wrapped around your senses, curling into your nostrils, burrowing into your brain. It wasn't just the scent of meat. It was something deeper, richer, something that stirred a primal need inside you. Something that made you salivate before you even stepped through the door. Brannigan's had been in town for longer than anyone could remember. The butcher shop sat at the edge of the small downtown strip, wedged between a boarded-up tailor shop and a flower shop that never seemed to have any customers. But Brannigan's always had a line. No matter the day, no matter the weather, people would stand outside, chatting in hushed, eager voices as they waited for their turn to step inside. They came from miles around, drawn in by something unexplainable. Something more than word of mouth. People swore by the place. They swore that once you'd eaten Brannigan's meat, nothing else would ever compare. The shop itself was warm and welcoming, the inside a stark contrast to the old and slightly worn exterior. Overhead lights cast a golden glow over the polished white tiles, and the air buzzed with the steady hum of a refrigerator unit in the back. Glass display cases stretched along the walls filled with glistening, perfectly marbled cuts of deep red meat. Thick steaks, plump sausages, ribs so fresh they seemed to quiver slightly. The place was spotless, almost too clean. There were no telltale splatters, no stray gristle or bits of bone, nothing that hinted at the messiness of a butcher's work. It was pristine. Behind the counter stood Brannigan himself. He was a broad-shouldered man with thick, meaty hands and a white apron that always seemed clean despite the nature of his work. His face was round and ruddy, his eyes small and dark beneath bushy eyebrows. He had a way of smiling that never quite reached his eyes, a deep, knowing grin that sent a prickle down your spine. He never had to push his products. People practically begged for them. Todd Fisher had never been one for small-town traditions. He had moved here 3 months ago, looking for an escape from the endless concrete sprawl of this city, trading in his cramped apartment for a small rental house at the edge of town. He wasn't the type to get caught up in local legends. He had rolled his eyes when he first heard the townsfolk gushing about Brannigan's, dismissing it as exaggerated small-town pride. But then he tasted the meat. It was at a cookout, hosted by his neighbor, an older man named Gary, who had been more than happy to welcome Todd into the neighborhood. The moment the first bite of sausage hit Todd's tongue, he felt something he couldn't describe. His skin tingled. His mouth flooded with saliva. The taste was impossible to put into words, deep, complex, richer than anything he had ever experienced. His stomach clenched in pleasure, and an overwhelming sense of satisfaction bloomed in his chest. He needed more. By the next morning, Todd was standing in line outside Brannigan's, shifting impatiently from foot to foot as he waited his turn. He spent far more money than he intended to, walking out with a heavy brown paper bag filled with steaks, ribs, sausages. That night, he cooked an entire steak for himself and ate it without pause. He ate until he was full, then kept eating until his stomach ached. And yet, when he finally stopped, he felt something strange, like a hunger that had just begun instead of being sated. Days passed, then weeks. Todd stopped buying meat from the grocery store. Everything else tasted bland, flavorless. Even the high-end cuts from the gourmet butcher in the next town over tasted wrong, as if they were missing some crucial ingredient. His freezer was soon stocked only with cuts from Brannigan's. He stopped going out to eat. He lost interest in the foods he used to love. But Todd was the type of person who always needed to know more, and as his addiction to Brannigan's meat deepened, so did his curiosity. One night, after a late shift at work, Todd was driving home when something caught his eye. The lights in Brannigan's shop were off, the closed sign hanging in the window, but around the back, the dull glow of taillights flickered in the darkness. Slowing his car, he pulled off to the side of the road, watching from a distance. Brannigan's old truck was backed up against the rear entrance. Todd squinted, his stomach turning as he realized where the truck had come from. The building just behind Brannigan's shop wasn't a warehouse. It was the town's nursing home. Todd sat frozen, watching as Brannigan moved to the back of the truck, his large hands gripping something long, wrapped in white sheets. Something that sagged in the middle as he lifted it over his shoulder and carried it into the shop. Todd knew what he saw. He knew. But the next morning, when he walked into Brannigan's, the only thing that filled his mind was the smell. That rich, intoxicating scent that wrapped around his brain like a drug, dulling his thoughts, making his stomach growl. Brannigan greeted him with his usual grin, sliding a thick, fresh cut across the counter. "Special cut today," he said, winking. Todd hesitated. His fingers trembled as he picked up the package, feeling the warmth still radiating through the butcher paper. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. And yet, he took it home. He cooked it. And as he ate, as the juices coated his tongue, the horror of what he had seen melted away beneath the overwhelming pleasure of the taste. He knew, and he didn't care. Days blurred into weeks. Todd stopped leaving town. He stopped answering calls from friends outside the area. Every time he thought about quitting, about leaving, something in his body protested. He would break out in a cold sweat, his stomach twisting violently, his limbs trembling. And then, just when he thought he might collapse, he would walk into Brannigan's, and all the pain would vanish the moment he took a bite. Then one night, as he lay in bed, stomach twisting with hunger despite having eaten an entire steak only an hour before, he heard a noise. A slow, deliberate creak from his front porch, then another, a heavy footstep, a knock, soft, patient. His breath hitched. The knock came again, firmer this time. His phone was dead. He had no way to call for help. And then from the other side of the door, a voice, deep, amused, unmistakable. "Running low, Todd?" He pressed a shaking hand over his mouth, willing himself not to make a sound. A pause. Then the voice again, closer this time, as if leaning against the wood. "I've got something fresh for you. Special cut." Silence stretched thick and suffocating. Then, ever so softly, the door handle turned. Mindworm Media. The house at the end of the street. Jason had always been fascinated by space. Ever since he was little, he had dreamed of being an astronaut, of floating weightlessly among the stars, of looking down at Earth from the black void beyond. His parents knew this. That's why on Christmas morning, they gave him the gift he had been secretly hoping for, a brand new telescope. It was sleek and black with an adjustable tripod and a powerful zoom lens, far better than the cheap plastic ones he had played with as a kid. That night, despite the biting cold, he set it up by his bedroom window, his fingers trembling with excitement as he adjusted the focus. The moon loomed large in the lens, its craters and valleys cast in ghostly shadows. He traced the constellations he had memorized from his books, following the glittering trails of Orion's belt, the Seven Sisters, the North Star. He lost himself in the vastness of it, feeling small, feeling at peace. But as the days passed, his excitement dulled. The stars were beautiful, yes, but distant. He wanted to see something new, something real. And so, without really thinking about it, he turned the telescope toward the ground. At first, it was innocent curiosity. He scanned the neighborhood, marveling at the way the lens brought everything into such sharp detail. The Petersons' dog curled up on their porch, Mr. Hammond drinking a beer in his dimly lit den, the flickering television in the house across the street. It was like peeking into 1,000 tiny worlds, each unaware that they were being watched. It wasn't spying, he told himself. It was observation. It was science. But then on the third night, he made a mistake. The old house at the end of the street had been abandoned for years. Everyone knew that. It was a rotting skeleton of a home, its shutters hanging loose, its windows caked in grime. Kids at school whispered that it was haunted, that something had happened there long ago, something bad. Jason had never paid much attention to the rumors. He wasn't afraid of ghosts. Ghosts weren't real. But that night, as he lazily swept the telescope across the street, his lens drifted to the house, and something inside made him stop. There was a light, a single flickering glow from a second-floor window. Jason frowned, adjusting the focus, his pulse quickening. Had someone moved in? He hadn't seen any moving trucks, no cars in the driveway, no sign of life at all. And yet there it was, that faint yellow light, like the flicker of an old candle. His hands tightened on the telescope. He leaned in closer. There was a man in the window. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The figure was perfectly still, seated in a wooden chair facing outward, his hands resting on his knees. The dim light barely illuminated him, but Jason could see his face, too pale, almost gray, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. He wasn't looking out the window. He was looking past it, beyond it, as if staring at something far away. Jason felt a cold trickle of unease crawl down his spine. The house had been empty for years. He was sure of it. So who the hell was that? He pulled away from the telescope, rubbing his eyes, telling himself he had imagined it. Just a trick of the light, just some old piece of furniture casting a shadow. But when he looked again, the man was still there, and he was closer. Jason's stomach twisted. He hadn't seen him move, hadn't seen the slightest shift. And yet, the man was now sitting directly in front of the window, his blank, sunken eyes staring forward, his lips slightly parted. Jason's fingers trembled on the focus knob. He suddenly felt very cold, despite the heater humming in his room. He swallowed hard, tearing his gaze away from the lens. Maybe it was a squatter, a homeless man who had broken in to escape the cold. That had to be it. But something about the way he sat there, unmoving, staring, made Jason's skin crawl. He shut the telescope and climbed into bed, forcing himself to forget about it. But he didn't forget. The next night, against his better judgment, he looked again. The man was still there. And he was even closer. Now Jason could see his face in horrifying detail. His skin was waxy and stretched too tightly over his skull, as if he had been left out in the sun too long. His eyes were wrong, too deep, too dark, like two pits that led into nothingness. And his mouth was moving. Jason's breath hitched. He couldn't hear anything, but the man's lips were forming words, slow and deliberate, repeating over and over. He felt his heart hammering in his chest. Was he talking to someone? No, the house was empty. There was no one else there. Was he talking to Jason? A wave of nausea rolled through him. He yanked his eye away from the telescope, hands slick with sweat, heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. This wasn't right. None of this was right. He told himself he wouldn't look again. He told himself he would forget. But as he climbed into bed, a sickening curiosity gnawed at the back of his mind. What was the man saying? On the fourth night, Jason made a mistake. He whispered back. It was barely a breath, just 3 words trembling on his lips. What are you saying? The man's mouth stopped moving. Jason's stomach dropped. His blood turned to ice. Slowly, stiffly, the man lifted one hand and pointed at Jason. Jason ripped his eye from the telescope so fast he nearly knocked it over. He stumbled back from the window, shaking, his lungs burning as if he had been holding his breath for too long. He squeezed his eyes shut, heart hammering against his ribs, whispering to himself that it wasn't real, it wasn't real, it wasn't real. Then, at 3:17 a.m., he woke to a sound. Tap, tap, tap. His breath caught. It was coming from the window. Jason squeezed his eyes shut. It wasn't real. He was dreaming. It was just the wind. Tap, tap, tap. He forced himself to look. The man was standing outside his window. His lips were moving again. Faster now, urgent, desperate. And this time Jason could hear him. "Now you see me," Jason screamed. The next thing he knew, his parents were in his room, the lights flooding everything in a warm, safe glow. His mother was holding him. His father was checking the window, his voice sharp and angry. "There's nothing here, Jason." And he was right. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign of forced entry, no shadow in the dark. But Jason knew the truth. The house at the end of the street was empty, but something had been waiting there, watching. And now it had seen him too.